Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green. I'm here in Sydney, Australia, where it's about 28 degrees, and I'm joined by Emily Kilcrease in Washington, D.C., where it's about 28 degrees. It's just that one's Fahrenheit and the other's Celsius. Thanks, Emily. You're a return guest, and we have a lot to catch up on tech and chips and rare earths. So really going to pick your brain for the next half hour.
Sounds great. I'm delighted to be back.
We normally start by asking people a bit how they got into this, but I'll just remind people of the most important parts. You went to Georgetown, Hoya Saxa, and then my alma mater, SAIS. So that pretty much tells people what they need to know, I guess.
That's right.
And Emily, just to remind people, was the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Rep overseeing development and negotiation coordination of foreign investment policy. So strategic level decisions about investments and economic and technology competition. And she's at the Center for New American Security, where she directs the Energy Economics and Security Program. Looking at economic security, we do a lot with the U.S. Studies Center, with Haley Channer and John Kunkel with Emily. She's one of the best in the field. And we had you on in February 2023 to explain the Biden administration's approach to technology competition with China. And everything from the CHIPS Act to Jake Sullivan's small yard, high fence approach, how to compete without catastrophe. It was all very disciplined. It was all very thought through. It seems like with the Trump administrations, a lot has really changed. But before we get to that and trying to explain that change, let's rewind to a different day, sort of when we met in 2023. What was the logic of focusing so much of the U.S. government regulatory apparatus and intelligence apparatus on competition over AI with China? What was at stake and what was the theory of the case?
Yeah, I mean, first you have to remember that the Biden administration's approach was really driven by their view that we were in a broader strategic competition with China. You heard the line over and over from them that China was the only competitor in the international system with the intent and potentially capability to kind of challenge the U.S. in the rules-based order, right? So they very much viewed China across all dimensions as a strategic competitor, and they were viewing their actions as being things that they needed to do to protect U.S. security interests and national interest in the context of that strategic competition. And then when they boiled it down to the next level, technology and economics were always a really critical part of that. A lot of the emphasis in the Biden administration was on what they called these force multiplier technologies. So here you're talking about supercomputing, you're talking about AI, you're talking about quantum. It's the technologies that in some respects are still nascent today, but that they viewed as being critical to winning future military battles down the line. And they viewed the next couple of years in the development of those technologies as absolutely critical in determining which country was going to have that advantage. And you can particularly think about that in the AI space, where if anybody has played with the models or has been using these LLMs and chatbots for the last couple of years, you can actually see that there's been just a huge amount of change. So that was their mindset. There's a bigger competition and the technology field is moving so fast that we need to win this competition in the next couple of years.
And I think it's fair to point out that the urgency around this competition on AI really started, as I recall, in the Pentagon. And it was the Joint Staff in particular in the Obama years, in the second Obama term, where war games and sort of future warfare studies showed how important AI would be. So the push came from the Pentagon, mainly around, frankly, warfighting scenarios and sort of military strategy. And then credit where credit's due, the Trump administration put a lot of those people who had been in uniform into key posts in the NSC and Commerce and State, and began with their national security strategy, a strategy based on the predicate that China's a revisionist power set and undermining American leadership and security. So it wasn't a disciplined approach, I think it's fair to say, but it was driven by strategy and strategic objectives. And then I'd say there was more continuity than change on this front from Trump to Biden.
Yes, absolutely.
In many ways. Biden, as you'd expect from Democrats, put more legal discipline around it, maybe too much for some people. Too many meetings, too many lawyers perhaps, but the line of effort was the same. All right, here we are in December 2025, and the second Trump administration, particularly in the last week, has undone a lot of it. So bring us up to speed for those who don't follow this too closely. What has been undone in the last few months.
Yeah, and I just want to footstomp the point you made about the continuity between Trump 1.0 to Biden. There was that through line, whether it was export controls or tariffs or just the general view that we are in the strategic competition and the U.S. needs to be doing new things, developing new economic security policies and instruments and implementing them as part of that competition. And so difference in approach, difference in terms of particularly how much we wanted to work with international partners, but like largely headed in the same direction. That is all different now. And I think fundamentally, there is a question about whether this administration believes that we are, in fact, in a strategic competition with China or not. If you look at, for example, the national security strategy that came out earlier this week, it clearly emphasizes that there are some concerns with China. We have concerns particularly, and this is where the lens most seems to be, is through the economic lens. So much less emphasis on the security threat that China presents, much less emphasis on the U.S. need to kind of keep China, I hate to say the word contained, but contained, from a regional security perspective, and much more just on, let's figure out how we can make a deal with China. Which brings me to, of course, the trade negotiations that have been ongoing with China, which are very much now bound up with this question of what's our tech policy towards China. I'm sure your listeners will know that the United States has been engaged in a pretty robust set of trade negotiations with China and pretty much every other country around the world following the Liberation Day tariffs. That has put the United States largely into a posture of trying to make nice with China throughout the course of the negotiations. And we should unpack a little bit why that has happened. It's partly because President Trump is himself not particularly a China hawk, and his emphasis is on how do we get to a deal and very much focused on not rocking the boat to kind of keep the leader-to-leader diplomacy and negotiations going. It's also because the U.S. at times over the past several months has, I would argue, overreached in some respects, right? We imposed 135% tariffs on China. China retaliated, and then all of a sudden we're like, whoa, none of us want to be here in terms of this escalating trade war. And then we had to back down. A very similar thing played out more recently when the U.S. released its export controls, expanding how it applied the entity list designations. It applied what's 50% rule, or kind of captures all subsidiaries that have a 50% ownership stake with the listed entity. Inadvertently, perhaps, they didn't realize they were going to capture 20 to 30,000 additional Chinese companies. China reacted. That's where we saw the rarest export controls. So it's been this period of overreach and then backing down. And now we're just kind of in this position where it's not clear that the United States actually can move forward with any further de-risking actions without sparking that retaliatory pattern yet again. So you layer that very complicated history of recent escalation, de-escalation, and trying to study the relationship with the fact that the Trump administration, and particularly Trump himself, prioritizes this economic deal-making above the broader strategic interest. And that brings us to a very different place than where we were under the Biden administration or even the first Trump administration.
So the national security strategy, which people who listen to this podcast will likely have read or read about. I'm not sure average Americans ever pay much attention to the national security strategy. I've worked on two of them in the White House. And when you're writing them, you think you're, Clausewitz or Machiavelli or whatever. And then you go out to a local restaurant in Bethesda and realize nobody really cares. But for the U.S. government, it's pretty important. It's supposed to discipline and set the direction for the Pentagon, which will have its national defense strategy, but also Commerce, USTR, State, generally, a well-run, strategically oriented administration will have its policies flow from that. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you could possibly do that if you were in one of these departments, because the NSS, it's a bit of a Rorschach test. I mean, you can look at it, and if you're deep anti-immigrant MAGA, you can say, yes, it has what I believe in. It attacks the Europeans. It warns they're facing civilizational erasure. It threatens to even interfere in their politics. But you could also be a kind of Mark Rubio, traditional Republican, and look and see the emphasis on deterrence and defending the first silent chain and allies. So it's really all over the place. And I also wonder how enduring it will be, because so much of it does seem almost tactically aligned with the April summit with Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
So you were in USTR. Like, if you were in the U.S. government right now working on these issues, could you make sense of what the strategy is meant to be?
I think there's a lot of mixed signals. And as you know well, Mike, from having been in the sausage making process, the outcome is important, but it's also the process to get everyone to agree on what the outcome should be that is almost as important. And it seems like that process to get to the final outcome was really messy. And I'm not sure they actually resolved a lot of the underlying conflicts. So just to give a couple of examples, right? You've got this long list of bad things that China does economically that we're going to fix. How are we going to fix them? There is no guidance on how we are going to fix them. I mean, you can intuit from other parts of the strategy or just the actions that the Trump administration has taken to date that a coercive tariff-led approach would be the way to go, except we've already tried that and it doesn't seem to be inducing China to change any of its behaviors, right? So that's very unclear. You've also got, I've used the phrase, it's a masterclass in gaslighting when it comes to coordination with our allies, because it talks about how we need to work together to combat Chinese predatory trade practices. And I think a lot of our allies see that and they're like, well, that would be great, but we would sure like you to stop your predatory trade practices against us with all of the tariffs that the United States has opposed. So there's just so many conflicting signals in there. So if you're in one of the agencies, I'm not sure that this strategy is really giving you much guidance on how to go about your day-to-day job.
Yeah, there is no single theory of the case in this national security strategy. The first Trump administration, H.R. McMaster, Nadia Shadalo, who came on this podcast to explain it, had as the theory of the case that we are in strategic competition for generations with China and Russia. And that's not there. It's not in there anywhere. So I sense it's not really, this is not going to be NSC 68. It's not going to be an enduring, it's a snapshot of where President Trump's mind is in December 2025. But the policies are concrete and we have seen changes. So allowing the NVIDIA H200 chips to be exported in April, rolling back a lot of the Biden era export controls, then introducing new ones that trigger the Chinese. It's hard for people to follow, but can you give us a kind of a brief list of what has changed and what is the same? We still have the CHIPS Act, right? We still have some aspects sort of have the CHIPS Act.
Yeah.
So what's a ledger sheet on the toolkit, I guess, to mix metaphors of technology competition? What's still in place? What's been undone?
Yeah. So just as a reminder, when we came into the Trump 2.0 administration, it had just been this one-way continual ratchet of expanding controls, particularly around chips and AI capabilities. In the last week of the Biden administration, we actually saw major new rules come out, like the AI diffusion rule, which was intended to impose a global licensing regime on AI chip distribution, including to some of our allies, controlling not just the chips, but also how many chips a country could get in recognition that just sheer computing power and volume of chips is itself kind of a national security interest, because that's what you need to actually train and empower powerful AI, particularly frontier AI capabilities. So you had that, plus you had an industrial policy posture that was very much about investments in the United States through government investments. So whether it was the CHIPS Act or it was the IRA on clean tech, that was the starting point. Trump 2.0 has taken a very different approach on all of that. So they immediately rescinded the AI diffusion rule. What's going to replace it? Still kind of TBD. They do seem to be very focused on the diffusion part of the AI diffusion rule. What's been less clear is how much that diffusion is going to be conditioned upon specific security requirements. So we saw, for example, I think it was over the summer, all of these deals with Gulf states about getting a bunch of chips into those regions, which are going to be really important for future AI data center capabilities. Still not a lot of information about how those deals are structured to prevent Chinese access to those capabilities. So that's a big question mark. And then, as you mentioned, you've got the direct exports to China. And we saw earlier in the administration, they first imposed controls on the H20 chip of NVIDIA, which was the chip that NVIDIA had specifically designed to be compliant with export controls so that they could send it to China. The Trump administration blocked that and then later allowed it. This week, we saw what is, in the eyes of China hawks, a more concerning rollback of export controls related to the H200, which is not NVIDIA's most advanced chip. It's not the Blackwell series, but it is a chip that had previously been controlled for export, and that has now been rolled back as well. Now, we can get into kind of how big of a deal that is for the broader AI competition with China, but I think there's also this broader point of imposing controls, rolling back controls. Why are the controls being rolled back? Is it because we've got very effective corporate lobbying? Is it because there's a desire to flood the zone? and just kind of outcompete Huawei in China? Can we keep China addicted to US tech? There's all sorts of different rationales floating around for why these decisions are being made. And then on top of all of that, if that weren't enough, on top of all of that, then you have a very different approach to industrial policy where you've got the CHIPS Act isn't dead, but it looks very different right now, where you've got a much heavier reliance on tariffs as a way to incentivize domestic manufacturing in the United States, as opposed to the government incentives. And even where you have companies that were recipients of CHIPS Act funding, like Intel, the government is all of a sudden very interested in playing a much more direct role, including through taking equity stakes in these companies. So it's a much more direct form of state capitalism than the Biden approach of just giving some incentives and hoping to catalyze that private sector investment. So on pretty much every dimension, things look a lot different now.
All right, this is extremely unfair, but I'm going to do it anyway because you went to Georgetown. You were School of Foreign Service?
I was college.
You were college? So you didn't have to do the dreaded geography map of the world quiz.
I did not do map of the modern world. I do regret it, though.
Well, it was, this is a thing that Georgetown School of Foreign Service freshmen have to do with. They are quizzed in front of a large group of other students on geography. That's right. They go up against faculty, and the faculty usually lost, so I never volunteered to do it. I think I know my geography. Anyway, this is in that spirit. This is extremely unfair, but I'm going to ask you you're not allowed to say it's all of the above. So I'm going to ask you to rank what you think the reasons for the change are. And I'll give you four reasons. One, Donald Trump blinked. In October, when Beijing expanded its export controls, really putting at risk access to key rare earth critical minerals like germanium, antimony, gallium, which are critical inputs for high-end military production, that came as a shock. And so with theory one is the president blinked. He threatened 100. I've lost track of how high the tariffs were going to be. And Xi Jinping had done his homework, called his bluff. Trump blinked. That's number one, blinked. Number two, you read this sometimes, it wasn't working. Yeah, there was too much leakage. China was building so many fabs, so many production facilities that just volume alone would overwhelm us. So that's the second one, it just wasn't working. The third argument, which you hear from the tech bros sometimes, is we can be even more clever. We can make China so dependent on our chips that they won't be incentivized to build a competitive industry. That's an argument you hear. And then the last one is Laura Loomer, lobbying, intrigue. The April rollback came, if my sequencing is right, after NSC staff were Loomered, after Laura Loomer's criticism got some key people fired. Coincidentally, mostly working on the stronger export controls. So, all right, those are your choices. We blinked. It wasn't working. There's a better strategy, which is make them dependent, or it's all palace intrigue. How do you rank them?
Well, since you're not actually grading me, or if you are, it doesn't affect my overall GPA, I might cheat and not totally follow instructions here. But I mean, I would say that the one that I'm least convinced of is the view that it's not working. Me personally, right? Like if you look at the technical analysis on China's ability to make chips or to make the type of tooling that's required to make advanced AI chips, they don't have it. There's some technical analysis that says that the H200 is like roughly on par with what Huawei can make through its Ascend series on a chip-by-chip basis. But what Huawei cannot do is make it at the volume that NVIDIA can make. And remember, for AI, volume of chips, volume of aggregate compute is really, really important. So if that was the locus of the decision, if they're working on the same information that everybody else is, then like that just doesn't hold up. That logic doesn't hold up. Now, you have heard your number 3 scenario, this keep China addicted to technology. I would actually link that with the Trump blinked one, which is how much are we accurately reading Chinese intentions to all and likely Chinese reactions to all of the U.S. actions. And I would argue we are not doing a particularly good job at that right now. Everything about China's industrial policy for the last decades has been about self-sufficiency, getting off of U.S. tech. It is, as you know, a little bit more complicated than that. You've got private sector Chinese firms who are just going to want the best technology available. But look at what the Chinese government's response to this loosening of export controls has been. It's thanks very much for this unilateral concession. We're now going to go tell everybody in China to not buy the NVIDIA chips because it runs directly counter to the goals of self-sufficiency. So I think we've just been misreading the China reaction very badly this entire time, unfortunately. And then on the lobbying loomer stuff, I mean, God knows, I don't know. I try not to understand that or even to look at that too closely, to be honest, Mike.
Yeah, and we don't know. And the corporate interests and the president's interest in a trade deal probably would explain it without that. But it adds a level of intrigue that some entrepreneurial journalist somewhere someday might. Not too nerdy think tank people. That's not what we do, except over beers.
That's right. That's right. Clearly, Jensen Huang has the ear of the president, right? That is not an insignificant factor here.
Yeah.
And he is pushing for loosening as many controls as possible and pushing this line of argument about, keep China addicted to our tech, which I don't think is winning him many fans in at least the national security hawk contingent in Washington.
No, well, that's what I wanted to ask about next, because you could see in the national security strategy pretty clearly that there are very different assumptions about the world and the nature of competition with China. I almost felt, I used the word Rorschach test, but I also felt when I was reading it, like I could even see different fonts depending on who had the pen. It felt like you could tell which part was the sort of Rubio part, which was the J.D. Vance part, which was America First, which was Republican internationalism. But there are other actors in this, and Congress has asserted itself on this issue pretty forcefully towards the Biden administration, for example, and less so with Trump and a Republican-controlled Congress. But you do see the Senate Armed Services Committee asserting itself on the ND, National Defense Authorization Act. You see them asserting themselves on Venezuela. And you now have a bipartisan group of senators saying, no, we're going to pass legislation saying you can't unwind some of these export controls. Say a bit, if you could, about the larger positioning of the Congress, experts and so forth on this. In other words, how sustainable is this rollback politically?
Yeah, and I'll first commend you. I don't know if this was intentional that you used a font metaphor just after we learned that Secretary Rubio has condemned the use of Calibri in State Department correspondence.
I didn't know that.
Yep, that came out. So apparently, we're going back to Times New Roman for official correspondence.
What's wrong with Calibri? Is Calibri woke or?
It's too woke. Yep, I think that was the rationale or something. Who knows?
Well, there's that. What's that German font? Anyway.
But to your point about the broader politics, I do think that it is very much worth watching congressional reaction, right? So you've got a U.S. Congress that is currently controlled, both houses, by Republicans, but pretty slim majorities and unruly ones at that sometimes. But where you've seen them push is on some of these foreign policy issues, right? So you've seen, for example, Molinar, the chair of the House Select Committee, being very strong on export controls and the need to maintain strong export controls. You saw in the NDAA that came out this week, they actually put outbound investment in there. This is an issue that's been kicking around Congress for a very long time and largely codifies what the administration is already doing through the Biden era executive order. But nonetheless, Congress did a thing on China competition, right? So that's helpful and that's forward progress. So I do think it's quite important to watch these efforts. In the AI space, we saw the GAIN AI Act, which is the one that was going to require any export of advanced AI chips to first satisfy a condition that there was no U.S. user that wanted that chip. That is not currently moving forward, but I would expect that to come back in the next Congress or next year. So I do think Congress and the broader U.S. foreign policy national security system, very much there are still very large contingents of that view strategic competition, that view pushing back on Russia as very important. I think there's even new legislation coming out in the U.S. later this week about the importance of keeping up sanctions pressure on Russia, right? So those interests are not going away. I don't think you see them come out more publicly. I think there's also been a lot of non-public quiet communication that's been happening on this. And I think another big one to watch, particularly as we get closer to the midterms, is pushback on the tariff and trade agenda. We're starting to see price issues in the United States. That's the kind of thing that really hits home for, most Americans. Who knows about the national security strategy, but they're going to go to the grocery store. And if it got really expensive to buy stuff, or if Christmas shopping is really expensive this year, that's the sort of thing that's going to change political sentiment. So I do think Congress has been and may continue to push back on some of these more aggressive foreign policy moves.
And it does. I mean, we do polling of the publics in the U.S. and Australia and Japan and India and so forth, but also Gallup polling, Chicago Council of Global Affairs. I mean, it does seem like being tough on China is good politics. And that you would get bipartisan support for a lot of the things that we were seeing, and that it would play well for Democrats in the midterms, frankly. President Trump's doing a trade deal, but it may help soybean farmers, but it's not likely to materially affect most Americans' lives. And if it comes at the cost of some of these policies that, most Americans don't understand them, But in our polling, for example, 2/3 of Americans, Australians, and Japanese think we are too dependent on China technologically and want to see de-risking. So, I never run for office. I don't know how you articulate that in an election, but it does seem like the rollback is not on solid political ground with the public.
I think that's right. And I think for the large part, like Americans want stability in the relationship, right? They want the U.S. to be winning. But like, if you ask U.S. farmers, do they love the fact that there was not a single soybean purchase for most of this year? They do not. Like, they don't want the aid from the U.S. They just want the business. And if they want to continue those exports, and the MSS said we should continue exporting and trading in non-sensitive sectors, right? Like that to me means we want stability in the relationship. We want predictability in the relationship, because that is what people are going to notice.
Well, there is a scenario where we trade soybeans for chips.
Oh, Mike. Did we already? No.
We'll see.
I mean, that's one of the narratives that I think is not right? Like, I think we're doing these export control concessions for reasons that are entirely unrelated to getting a concession out of China. China's not giving us anything for these.
So let's talk about allies in all this. You wrote a really good piece at the beginning of this whole, well, not at the beginning, but about 3-4 years ago, explaining that the U.S. does not have enough share of the semiconductor manufacturing technology or chip technology to dictate what the policy would be. We need Japan, Korea, Netherlands with ASML, and Taiwan in particular. We don't need a lot of countries, frankly. I mean, the French and German semiconductor industry doesn't really get a big vote. We do need Korea, Japan, Netherlands, Taiwan. And, the Biden administration put a lot of work into that. And we discussed this last time, but my sense was that the corporate boards in Korea, Japan, and the Netherlands in particular were quite divided. They knew that they were at risk of being raided and reverse engineered. And on the other hand, they needed the exports to China for their R&D budgets. They were quite conflicted. And I thought the Biden administration did a pretty good job tipping the balance within a lot of these corporate boards and within METI in Japan and the intelligence services and so forth. But now allies are looking at this and they must be really confused. What's you talk to these companies and these governments a lot. What's your sense of where the allies, are they just sort of pausing to see how this shakes out? Are they going with NVIDIA and saying, woohoo, back to an open spigot? I mean, what's your sense of where allies, who really have the majority of the technology, frankly, where are they?
Yeah, first I would say, I think the overriding sentiment is just confusion, because they're just not sure where U.S. policy is going. None of these countries want to get out in front of the United States on China de-risking. None of them want to do it themselves. We did a trade war game where we were trying to play out some of these dynamics with the U.S. trying to make a deal with China as it's imposing tariffs on everyone else and trying to push a de-risking agenda, all these different factors. And it was notable that, like, in the course of the game, as soon as the United States started negotiating with China, all the other countries were like, well, we're not doing anything on China de-risking. We're not going to sanction China. We're not going to do more export controls. And that's exactly what has played out in the real world, which is, very predictable, even if you don't do a trade war game, because the U.S. leadership, the U.S. making the case consistently to allies about why these controls are in our collective strategic interest. Like, that has been what made the difference in getting that allied cooperation. So not only do you not have the U.S. leadership role in trying to build that coalition, you have the U.S. walking away from its own controls. And so I do think it's going to be incredibly difficult to make any forward progress on the de-risking agenda, which is too bad, because when the Trump administration came in, so many of these governments were like, we're going to disagree on so many things, but that's the thing we can agree on, because look at everything that happened in Trump 1.0. There was a moment at the beginning of this administration where I think they could have made so much progress. Europe was primed for it. Europe is so frustrated with China because of all the support to Russia. Japan was primed for it. I'd be curious your thoughts on everything that's happening with Japan after the Taiwan comments, right? But I think a lot of our allies are just feeling a little bit left out in the cold, and that's not really easy to bounce back from.
I mean, well, since you asked, Takeichi is a national security realist, was the economic security minister. And Lee Jae-myung in Korea, although he's on the left, is leading a government where some of the key foreign policy people are also national security realists. Korean public opinion, Japanese public opinion about China they're more alarmed than American people are. And the American people are pretty alarmed. So I don't think, my guess would be, yes, exactly right. It's hard to impose export controls on companies in Japan and Korea. And so they're not going to get ahead of the US and impose more controls than we are. I don't think they'll backslide, in part because of, not at a strategic level. You'll see companies maybe starting to test what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But I would certainly advise them to be careful, because watch the movement on the Hill. This is not a permanent situation. Right. Mm-hmm. And contingency happens. Things will happen. The rare earth metal export ban is going to bite. And there's going to be military things that PLA does. So this is not a static situation. The politics of it will get challenging. So companies would probably be wise, and governments would be wise. It's understandable they're sort of frozen right now in terms of de-risking, but I think they'd be wise not to think, okay, the teacher's out of the classroom, let's start, drinking beer. Because the teacher's going to, if you look at the legislation, if you look at the kind of inconsistency in Trump's own approach, teacher could come in the back door of the classroom at any moment and you're busted. So, but I'm sure there are intense debates in the boards of many of these companies about, if we just loosened up a bit, we'd bring in another $500 million a year in profits we could use on research. And that's what we're all about, is building better chips. So we are taking discipline out of the system, but hopefully fear and self-preservation keeps a bit of inertia. The other thing is, you've seen that when Japanese or Korean or Dutch companies do start exploring what's possible, they often get busted in the media by Micron or one of the US companies. The American companies are also watching. Yep. So anyway, it's not a great situation, but tell me if you think I'm wrong. I don't think we're looking at a sudden collapse of what the current policy is. The car is in park right now, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I do think, again, going back to what we were saying about just, there's a lot of forces in the US political system that are still very hawkish and very much want to move forward with the agenda. I used to be of the theory that, Trump could get frustrated if the leader level conversations don't go well, that you would see kind of a snap back to more aggressive measures. He may still get frustrated if he's not getting what he wants out of the leader to leader engagement, but I think he's going to be pretty constrained in taking more aggressive actions, again, because of the rare earth dynamic and China's willingness to use that card. But I think that means we stay frozen, even if the frustration level rises.
So looking forward, let's say 10 years in the AI race, how significant is this rollback? Is this a game changer? And now the US was winning, now we're going to lose. Is it a speed bump? Is it how would you characterize where we are? How worried are you that we are now ceding the race because of this rollback of the export controls?
I think a lot of it's going to depend on how many chips they actually license to go. So if all of a sudden the floodgates open and you see just massive amounts of H200s going into the China market, and they're actually kind of serving most of the demand there, at that point, I don't care if we outcompete Huawei. I am very much worried about the capabilities we just gave to China on AI, right? Kind of regardless of where they're coming from. But we don't know what the licensing policy is going to look like. And also, China is pushing back on its companies using these chips, right? It does not want to be reliant on the US tech. And so I don't have a clear sense of how that's going to play out. I do think we need to just keep in mind that compute is the one area where the US is very firmly ahead. It is what is enabling our labs to sprint ahead. But that doesn't mean that China doesn't have its own unique capabilities, right? They're going to innovate. They're going to find ways to get around the compute thresholds. I'm not a technical person to be able to tell you what those workarounds might be, but we've seen them experimenting with that, right? You've seen Huawei trying to get as much at DUV technology to advance their chip production capabilities as they can in light of the fact that they can't get the EUV. You've seen DeepSeek trying to get around its compute constraints, including through smuggling chips as well as just innovation, to still make progress and do pretty well at it, right? So I would hesitate to make a bold prediction about 10 years in the future at this point.
Fair enough. Ben Buchanan in his book says the AI race is basically about compute chips, computational mechanics, and then also algorithms and big data. And that the US and our allies are ahead. People debate how much, but ahead on computation. I'll end with this question. I had dinner last night with an American investor who is investing in making a lot of money in tech. And he made a really interesting point. He said, people always talk about compute algorithms and big data, but there's a fourth quality, which is basically almost cultural.
Yes.
And he said, when you use DeepSeek, it has no sense of humor. The more advanced Google engines, ChatGPT, OpenAI, and so forth, you can actually joke with them. They're developing a sense of humor. Mm-hmm. And that his theory was that, over time, humans will respond to more human AI. And China's constrained because they literally have people using algorithms for word searches, but policing what's said about Xinjiang or Tibet or democracy. And that's really going to constrain a fourth dimension people don't talk about, which is the quality of the experience. What do you think? I was quite intrigued by that.
I think that's right. It gives me a good opportunity to plug Paul Shari's work, because in his book, For Battlegrounds, he talks about institutions as
that's another way of putting it.
Yeah, which gets at this, right? But like, if you think about all of the things that people might use AI for, like you need to have a level of trust in that system to give it that data, to trust the information it gives to you. Like if I'm asking it for medical advice, or if my kids are talking to it, right? Like in my personal view, like the companies that figure out how to avoid all the dumb stuff that our social media companies do, like that's going to be should be a winning formula, right? In terms of like, how do you build the trusted institutions? How do you have the safe institutions? How do you make sure you're not enabling catastrophic risk or, that has a technical component to it, but it's a governance function. It's a societal function. It's how do we want to interact with technology in our lives? And like, that is where America should win.
Well, a lot is at stake, Emily, a lot. It began largely in the Pentagon around battle space management and the application of AI to the warfighting scenarios, but it also extends to misinformation and narratives within the U.S., but around the world in what is an ideological competition. It goes to commercial competitiveness, infrastructure, digital infrastructure, monopolies, and basically hegemonic control. As Kennan put it in his first seminal national security strategy draft, it's about defending our way of life. Mm-hmm. And lots at stake. This is a weird chapter in the story, but I think we both agree it's one chapter. It's probably not the final chapter. This is a debate that will continue. So thanks for unpacking it. It's been great.
Yeah, and I look forward to coming back in 10 years and seeing how it all went.
When we've won.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Mike.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.